Or thought of another way, I mentioned that, we could probably afford 0.25% of our GDP for making life multiplanetary. That's the cost if you have a fully reusable rocket. The cost if you don't have a fully reusable rocket on the same barometer would be 100% of the GDP. And that would mean no money for food, healthcare, or anything else. And obviously that's impossible. So that's why I think a fully and rapidly reusable system is fundamentally required for life to become multiplanetary, for us to establish life on Mars. Mars is the only realistic option for another planet. Venus being too hot, Mercury being way too hot, Jupiter being a gas giant, and the moons of Jupiter are a possibility, but it's much further out and it's harder in a lot of different ways. And the moon is sort of too small and resource poor to make life multiplanetary. Emphasize not just to have a little base. A little base is not that interesting, but a self-sustaining human civilization is that's on multiple planets where life could continue even in the event of a calamity on Earth. That is the real thing. Yeah, so I think this is pretty exciting, and I think everyone in America and arguably the rest of the world should be pretty fired up about what we're doing, and hopefully wish us well. And we'll do our best to succeed in this regard. And yeah, it's definitely going to be an adventure. And I'll say one final thing, which is that sometimes people say, well, what is the business model for Mars? And sometimes they think, well, can you mine Mars and bring things back? And that is not a realistic business model for Mars, because it's always going to be far cheaper to mine things on Earth than Mars. But I do think that there's a business model where if you can reduce the cost of a flight to Mars, or moving to Mars, to around the cost of a middle-class home in California, which these just seem to be rising over time. Maybe not recently, but certainly pretty expensive. So maybe to around $500,000. Then I think you would have enough people would buy a ticket and move to Mars to be part of creating a new planet and be part of kind of the founding team of a new civilization. You don't you don't obviously have to be willing to have quite an appetite for risk and adventure. But there's 7 billion people on Earth now. There'll be probably 8 billion by the midpoint of the century. So even if 1 in a million people decided to do that, that's still 8,000 people. And I think probably more than 1 in a million people will decide to do that. So that's what I think is sort of the Mars business model, if you will. And then ultimately Mars can probably export intellectual property like software and inventions and things like that. If you can sort of beam it back with photons, that's sort of the better way to go.